Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mom coming at you with another APUSH video. Today we're taking a look at topic 8.10, the African American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Now, when we talked about African American civil rights in the 1950s previously, we talked about some key important milestone events such as Brown versus Board of Education, the integration of Little Rock Central High School, the Montgomery bus boycott, and of course the rise of Martin Luther King. But note, even though these major achievements have been gained, we still do not have what is the primary goal of the movement, a real, legitimate Civil Rights Act that is going to create real equality for African Americans in this country. Now, when it came to civil rights in the 50s, Eisenhower was lukewarm. He was somebody that was not going to be advocating for civil rights, but in the case of the Little Rock 9 situation, he was not going to defy a court order. So in other words, he wasn't going to try to influence what the law and what the court would do, but he would just simply enforce whatever is decided. Now, when we get into the 1960s and the presidency of John F. Kennedy, Kennedy on the campaign trail in 1960 was not a real full-throated supporter of civil rights. And a lot of this had to do with the politics of the time. Remember, this is still a time where the Deep South was very, very, very loyal to the Democratic Party. And Kennedy needed that Southern support to win in 1960. And coming out in support of civil rights would certainly hurt his chances of defeating Nixon that year. So we see Kennedy fairly mum on the issue. However, through the work of the civil rights movement, through the use of boycotts and protest marches, lawsuits, more and more attention the media brought to it, Kennedy's not going to be able to just ignore the situation. He's going to have to address it. And we will start to see Kennedy come out in support of integrating more of America's schools and using federal troops to do it, such as the integration of Ole Miss in 1962 and the University of Alabama in 1963 in defiance of course, Governor George Wallace trying to block the entryway. Now, we'll also see during the Kennedy years the use of, the sit-in protest, but also another phase of the fight, which was focusing in on integrated busing. And this is going to be the work of the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders were young people that, in order to, force the implementation of a court order, will begin to organize integrated bus rides through the American South. Now, this is going to, as you can imagine, raise the ire of, Southern whites that were, in favor of segregation. We'll even see one of the buses for the Freedom Riders actually be firebombed in Anniston, Alabama, and many of the riders beaten. But once again, this is another example of protesters willing to endure the slings and arrows, willing to, suffer the indignities to bring attention to a moral, noble cause, the need to integrate society and to eliminate Jim Crow. Now, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to continue to be the name and face of the movement, as is putting more and more pressure on Congress to try to do something about civil rights. And of course, Dr. King is going to continue his use of nonviolent protest to try to affect change. And remember, Dr. King's attitude is that you have to confront the injustice. You have to confront where the evil and the immorality is. And as far as Dr. King is concerned, if you're going to be targeting attention and, trying to, confront the most unjust city in the American South, for Dr. King, that was Birmingham. Birmingham had a notorious police force that was pretty brutal in enforcing Jim Crow segregation laws. And for Dr. King, the perfect place to host a nonviolent protest march. Now, when he organizes this march, this is going to be a march that's going to be mostly made up of teenagers, young people, high school age and junior high kids, that he's going to be organizing in the streets of Birmingham to walk the streets, to bring attention to the issue. And even though the local city, the local city government was saying that they were, violating ordinances that prevented this kind of protest, they would not be deterred. They were going to do their nonviolent protest march. And in response, we will see the local police force act in a brutal way, as many would predict it. We will see the local police force use heavy-duty, high-pressure fire hoses to try to attack the marchers and try to stop them. We will see the use of attack dogs, German shepherds, to go after protesters that were simply, non-violently walking the streets to bring attention to the injustice of segregation, to gain civil rights, to gain equality under the law. Now, when Americans see this on the nightly news, when they see photographs of this in national newspapers, Americans across the country will be embarrassed, and it will look shameful on the global stage that America, a nation that, supposedly stands for truth and justice and equality, would be willing to use these kinds of, almost authoritarian tactics, if you will. And this kind of attention is exactly what Dr. King is trying to obtain. Now, in the midst of this protest, King and hundreds of others of these protesters will be arrested and will temporarily be placed in jail overnight. From this jail cell, Dr. King will write the Letter from Birmingham Jail, which is going to be a very significant document that is going to explain the necessity for confronting injustice and the willingness and the necessity to use civil disobedience. And in many respects, explaining why you can't delay the action. And in some parts, calling out people that he believes should take more action. Those that were too scared to be confrontational. Those that were allies that were afraid to, be criticized in public. He's going to be basically saying, this is the time. We have to act now. And continuing in this process, as we see more and more of an attempt to put pressure on Congress, we're going to be seeing, lack of action. Kennedy is going to try in 1963 to get a Civil Rights Act passed, but he can't get it done. Southern Democrats, even though they're members of his own party, are not going to listen to a Yankee Northeasterner, come down and tell them how to run their states. It just isn't going to happen. So Kennedy's hitting a roadblock. But not to be deterred, Dr. King is going to be organizing an even bigger protest, this time at the nation's capital, to directly put pressure on Congress to create a Civil Rights Act. And at this March on Washington, you will see upwards of 200,000 people in support of ending Jim Crow, in support of ending racial discrimination, being in attendance for what is going to be one of the most iconic speeches in all of American history. Of course, we are referring to the I Have a Dream speech. And of course, when if you were to dissect the I Have a Dream speech, it talks about, that America is going to be founded on promises. The idea that all men are created equal. And for those in the black community, for those that were people of color, this promise is now time to be paid. In other words, this was a pledge, a promise to achieve it. Now it is time to make it real. He talks about a society where you are not judged by the color of your skin, but rather the content of your character. Where he envisions a society where black kids and white kids can freely play together and pray together. And when that time will come, we will be free at last. In many respects, this, is, the iconic moment of the civil rights movement. But still, nonetheless, Kennedy is going to come up short in his attempts to try to get a Civil Rights Act passed. But by the end of the year, Kennedy will no longer be president following his assassination. This will then lead to, of course, Lyndon Johnson becoming president. And Johnson, though a Southerner from Texas, born and raised in Jim Crow society, will immediately pick up the torch that Kennedy had left behind and will make a promise and will make a pledge to make sure that we will achieve civil rights. The time had come. And unlike Kennedy, who did not have as much experience in Congress as Johnson had, who did not, have the credibility of being a Southerner to propose this change that Johnson did, Johnson's going to be able to use wizardry to get enough votes cobbled together to finally get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. And this will be, as you can imagine, seismic in its significance. The Civil Rights Act is going to abolish, by law, Jim Crow segregation. No longer will you be able, as a state or a community, to be able to have signs that say drinking fountains for whites and drinking fountains for blacks. All of those signs of, legal segregation, gone, illegal now in all ways, shape, or forms. It also is going to ban discrimination in hiring on account of race, religion, gender, or national origin. Now, of course, most of the attention of that part of the law is going to focus in on the aspect of race. But do not forget that gender is also going to be a part of this. And this is going to be significant later on when we get into the feminist movement. It also will create the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, which is going to be a government agency that will assist people that believe that they have been denied an equal opportunity or been denied or had been discriminated, rather, when applying for a job on account of race, gender, religion, etc. The government will help file lawsuits in that regard. Now, that's not to say that it's easy to prove that discrimination has happened, but it shows that the government is trying to help. Now, with the Civil Rights Act attained, do not think that this is the end of the road. There are still many other issues that Black Americans are trying to address in the name of equality. And one of those issues that's not really addressed in the Civil Rights Act, voting protection. We know that going back to Reconstruction that Black Americans had a protected right to vote via the 15th Amendment. However, we also know that there were many state regulations that were put in place, grandfather clause, poll tax, literacy tests, etc., that were designed in reality to keep Black Americans from being able to vote, and those efforts were very successful. Now, we will see, the Constitution amended in 1964 to abolish the poll tax, which is certainly an accomplishment, but there still existed in many states the insidious literacy tests, and this is going to continue to bring attention in terms of trying to abolish another vestige of racial discrimination. This will lead to the Selma March, which was going to see protesters travel nonviolently in a march from Selma, Alabama, to Alabama's capital in Montgomery. But unfortunately for those protesters, similar to what had happened in Birmingham 2 years earlier, we will see local police forces tell the protesters to disperse, and when they refuse, we will see the use of tear gas, billy clubs, mounted police officers beating some of these protesters within an inch of their life. Once again, the nation is appalled. The nation is embarrassed. They cannot believe that people that are just simply non-violently protesting to get the most basic of political rights are going to be treated in this way. And because of the pressure, because of the notoriety through the media, we will see Johnson come up with another very important achievement. We will see the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which will now abolish forever literacy tests. Those are now gone. It also, as a way to try to protect these voting rights, it will include a provision that will stipulate that if you are a state that has a history of Jim Crow segregation, so basically the old Confederacy for the most part, if you wanted to change your election and voting laws, which are almost all exclusively state and local laws, that you would have to get permission from the Justice Department, the federal government, to be able to make those laws. In other words, you cannot continue to manipulate state laws like they have done in the past to keep Black folks from voting in reality. And that provision will stay on the books for the next, 50 years approximately. And so this is going to be a back-to-back major achievements in the fight for racial equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.